Good evening, and welcome to this edition of Labor Vision. I'm Bob Delaney, Executive Director of the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Labor Vision, a production of the Institute, focuses on topics of importance and interest to working Rhode Islanders. We hope you enjoy this evening's edition.
And the company finks and the deputy sheriffs had made the raid. Went to the union hall when a meeting it was called. And when the company boys came round, she always stood her ground. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union. Oh, you can't scare me, I'm sticking to the union. I'm sticking to the union till the day I die.
My interest in the Labor History Society, in terms of my labor heritage and my Irish American heritage, really has shown me the democratizing effect that the labor movement has had, not only in Rhode Island, but around the world.
I joined the Labor History Society because I think it's imperative the history of labor be preserved in Rhode Island.
I have been a proud member of the board of the Rhode Island Labor History Society for many years. Last year, I was honored to give the annual Labor Day address at the Meshasik Cemetery in Central Falls, site of the 1934 Salesville Massacre, on behalf of the society. I know that the true trade unionist knows their labor history. I know that the true trade unionist knows and respects the tremendous courage and sacrifice of labor's brave trailblazers. And I know that no other trade unionist in this state has given more of themselves to keep labor history alive than our own Rhode Island labor historian, Dr. Scott Molloy. Thank you, Scott, for a labor well done.
Long before the establishment of the Rhode Island Labor History Society in 1987, Ed Brown, the first secretary-treasurer of the combined AFL-CIO, was waging a lonely battle to preserve working-class history. In the early 1960s, he wrote a series of letters to many local unions, inquiring about their beginnings in the state. In 1975, Ed distributed a mimeographed history of his findings to the delegates at the State Federation of Labor's annual convention. About the same time that Ed Brown shared his work with his colleagues, a small group of academics at Brown University were meeting at the Rhode Island Historical Society Library in an attempt to put together the first professional publication dealing with labor history in our state. The person behind that, more so than anyone else, was an independent academic named Paul Buell. And these people would stay in Rhode Island for a number of years and contribute heartily to the early history of the society. In the mid-1970s, a local history student who had recently graduated with a master's degree from the University of New Hampshire found it difficult to find a regular, decent-paying job, went to a place that had been home to his grandfather and a couple of his uncles, the Rhode Island Public Transit Authority. Scott Molloy, as a RIPTA bus driver, said he made good money under a contract that provided great benefits and protective working conditions. Unfortunately, he thought his co-workers seemed unaware that this horn of plenty came from the union. So he decided to do the research which would lead to a publication about that history, so each and every member would no longer have an excuse not to give the union credit for what they received on the job.
But Scotty did something that the rest of us that were doing that kind of stuff didn't do. He went systematically and began to listen and record the stories of older workers, people that had gone through the 30s, gone through those incredible struggles. A lot of us had mentors that were older, but Scotty was systematic in understanding that we needed now to have a record of those years.
Scott also haunted the Rhode Island Historical Society Library, where he bumped into the Brown students in the mid-1970s. Both groups came together almost seamlessly with the same mission, and in 1977, Scott, with their assistance, was able to put out his first publication, A History of Division 618, the Union and the Company, harking all the way back to the Civil War. The Brown University students remained hard at work, and a year later, in 1978, published a quarterly journal called the Radical History Review. It was the first professional publication from an academic standpoint about the history of Rhode Island working people, stretching all the way back to Slater's Mill in 1790, all the way up to an interview with Al Sisti, a local steel worker, in the 1970s. These folks had an activist bent, and they got involved with a newly created, a newly minted organization as well called CLOC, the Community Labor Organizing Committee. In that capacity, found themselves on picket lines during the deindustrialization period of the 1970s, like Gorham's, Brown & Sharp, and Washburn Wire. By the mid and late 1970s, many of these early academic activists, now with a PhD, usually from Brown University, left the area for academic jobs, and left behind were Paul Buell, who stayed here until his retirement, as well as Scott Molloy, who was still driving a bus. Along the way, they picked up many other people, including Gail Sansbury, one of the most key individuals in helping us put the Labor History Society together. Scott Molloy got the idea to institutionalize the Labor History Society, fearing that with such a loss, it was imperative to put this on a professional basis in order to make sure that it would last the test of time. In 1987, the organization was formed with a $500 grant from the Providence Central Labor Council. The Labor History Society held its first banquet in 1988 and included people like Ed Brown, Rose Tretendi, Monsignor Edmund Brock, Larry Spitz, Bob McKenzie, and Paul Buell. The society branched out and did other things once it became organized in a better way. We helped gather collections of material that went to the Historical Society Library, where once there was a wasteland. Other collections have gone to the Smithsonian, as well as to the Special Collections Library at the University of Rhode Island. And perhaps more important than anything else, the Labor History Society has placed an emphasis on the publication of Rhode Island labor history. We subsidized the printing of different pamphlets and books, as well as helping out academics who might take a popular Rhode Island labor history topic, and we would buy copies for all 400 or 500 of our members. We continue to branch out, and over the last 10 or so years have been the main contributors to History Day, where students in junior high school or high school put together projects about labor history, and more than any other group in the state, we make cash contributions totaling over $1,000 to these young scholars, hoping that they will become more involved in labor activities. At the same time, the Society has put out innumerable pamphlets, whether it's about Seth Luther, Rhode Island's first agitator, the industrial workers of the world in Rhode Island, a guide to the study of local labor research. Thanks to Paul Buell, a history of oral interviews with local labor activists that was put together in a book called Rhode Island Working People. We also provide speakers. We provide free or discounted tickets anytime we see a labor play, for example, Waiting for Lefty, or the murder trial of John Gordon. One of the other things that we have accomplished is that we helped establish the Woonsocket Museum of Work and Culture. Today we have approximately 450 members and quite a few unions that have signed on over the years. The dues are the same as they were way back in 1987. The executive board of the Labor History Society is a wonderful mixture that reflects Rhode Island in many ways. Great occupational diversity from electricians, teachers, factory workers, retirees, professors, state workers, and the list goes on and on. Most of all, we don't abandon our past. When Ed Brown, who was in many ways the originator of the Labor History Society, on his 100th birthday, when he was in a nursing home, members of the Labor History Society went there with a cake, and we sang happy birthday and solidarity forever, because we don't forget our members or our friends. Perhaps even more importantly, we never forget the collective contributions of ordinary rank and file members here in the state. And that was exemplified in the 75th anniversary at Salesville Moshassuck Cemetery, where one of our members, Ryan McIntyre, helped put together a granite monument which commemorated the deaths of several workers during the 1934 textile strike, which was of a national basis. So through thick and thin, this Labor History Society has done everything in its power to keep alive the warm and wonderful history, and sometimes tragic history, of ordinary people. And we expect to be doing that long into the future.
Congratulations to the Rhode Island Labor History Society on its 25th anniversary. Because of Scott Molloy's leadership and your efforts, the Rhode Island labor movement will live forever because of you.
The Union forever defending our rights. Down with the black leg workers unite. With our brothers and our sisters, together we will stand. There is power in a union.
We usually have 4 or 5 honorees. Tonight we have just one, and yet this is the largest banquet we have ever had. Scott is the reason. He's a political activist, a labor leader, historian, author, teacher, mentor, and Irish activist. You're going to hear about all of that tonight. But as someone who's been his friend for 45 years, I'm going to start off this evening of acute embarrassment for Scott by talking about him as one of the most thoughtful and kindest people I have ever known.
We built relationships with other working people because that's what Scott knew. He knew that for the labor movement to be impressive and together, it had to be up and marching. Because when we're up and marching and our arms are linked, nobody can defeat us.
But Scott and Ken Dooley and Peter Martin and Pat Connolly their testimony collectively was absolutely crucial in convincing the General Assembly to pardon John Gordon and in convincing Governor Chafee to sign the pardon, which rehabilitated the long vilified and unjustly vilified reputation of John Gordon.
My doctorate in history at Duke, and at the point at which I was free to move to wherever my dissertation research took me, it took me to Providence, and one of the first things I did was look up Scott. I had already read Trolley Wars and a few of Scott's other articles and already figured out he was the go-to guy for anyone interested in Rhode Island labor history.
Now, Scott has moved from the front of the bus to the front of the class, and it's been a very joyous excursion for him and for all who admire his zeal and his commitment and his brilliance. And that brilliance has enlightened all of us about Rhode Island history, about the courageous saga of the American labor movement, and about our state's Irish-American heritage. And so for illuminating, Scott, these momentous issues and others, like the innocence of John Gordon, thank you, Scotty. You have beamed us all up.
Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Scott Molloy.
It's only 8 o'clock. Oh, this is a 90-minute lecture. Oh, I don't want to hear any crying. As soon as you're done, you'll be taking an exam book and doing it a question at a time. So don't think you're getting off on this. Pay attention. I want to thank my presenters, Kathy and Tom and Don and Eve, and especially my mentor, Dr. Patrick T. Conley, for their wonderful words. I've been friends with them for decades. I imagine I'll be friends with them for eternity. I also want to thank a couple other people who've been working behind the scenes tonight. Bob Walsh, who was kind enough to MC this. Jimmy Riley, who for once in his life is taking second fiddle to my tie, not his. He's got some bow tie made in Afghanistan on. Where did that come from? I also want to thank, because they often get left out and they do a heck of a job and a lot of work and toil, the people who put those videos together, Roger Boudreau and Fred Hubbard, right back there. Roger and Fred. And I want to thank Mike D'Amico of the Brotherhood of Electrical Workers Local 99, one of the greatest unions in our history here, for putting all of these beautiful labor memorabilia on the wall here. It's just gorgeous. And Mike, you do it every year and you're great. And not only that, Mike was able to bring in ambient tonight, the people who set up the sound systems, the televisions, and a whole host of other things that I'm a guy who doesn't even have a cell phone and can't turn the new TV on. So thank you for your expertise as well. But I also want to thank some other people. And don't worry, this is not going to be a long thing, but I owe so much to coworkers. And it's a funny trip from bus drivers to being a professor at URI, kind of like the odd couple. And I'm right in between. I've got friends sitting here tonight from Elmwood Avenue and the Reservoir Triangle, who I've been friends with for more than 55 years and still get together every couple of months to have lunch, so we never lose touch, because we had such an impact on one another. My neighbors, you, the rank and file, not only of your local union, but of the Labor History Society. You've helped me tremendously, because I've stolen, I've pilfered, I've incorporated your humor, your personality, and your courage. There's a little bit of each and every person sitting here tonight that I've stuck somewhere in my body or my head. And I thank you very, very much, and I never forget that. And I want to say just couple more thank yous at my table, my family table, which once upon a time would have been 10 tables, but time has taken its toll. I want to thank the beautiful woman that I live with, Marcia, who picked out this suit and tie. And Ned said to me, "Boy, you look so good, I need to go out and buy a new outfit too." So Jimmy Riley and Paul Mora, move over. I also have one of my two daughters here tonight, Kelsey, who just flew in from the University of Alberta in Winnipeg, where she's getting a master's degree. She was one, you may remember, she was one of the two Solidarity sisters, the little girls who got up here and sang Solidarity Forever with Rick Brooks so many years ago, and now she's a young woman. I want to thank my sister Jackie and her husband Joe Igliozzi, who are here tonight, and we still remain very close and actually went to Ireland together just earlier this year. I want to say thank you to Richard Vanaco, who's sitting there. He's become kind of my adopted father and a wonderful man. And also Marsha's son, Robbie Carbone, and his wife, Kim, and they have a beautiful 2-year-old son, who I wish you'd let us take him more. He's so adorable. So we'll get there. I grew up a mere stone's throw from this place we gather tonight, right down in Elmwood Avenue, just below Columbus Square. My father, who was one of 10 children, the son of an Irish immigrant and a poor Yankee. My mother, on the other hand, was an only child from a very genteel family.
My dad graduated from Central High School in 1943, a sports star in several areas, and graduated in order to walk the deck of an aircraft carrier in some of the most vicious battles the world has ever seen in the Sea of Japan in 1944 and 45. My mom graduated the same year, right across the street from Central, but hundreds of miles away in some areas, from classical. She was a drum majorette, received a scholarship to Pembroke College, which was then the women's side of Brown University. She got another scholarship to go to Baltimore to become a Rosie the Riveter, working for the Glenn Martin Aircraft Company in Baltimore as a Rosie the Riveter, a draftsman or a draftswoman. My mom and dad got married at the end of the war. My father went off to play top farm team baseball with the St. Louis Cardinals. But sometime before he left, my mother got pregnant with me. And I guess the absence was just too much for him, and he finally came home, even though he had a very promising baseball career, and he would blame me the rest of his life. That it was my fault. When he returned, he had to finally get a real job, and he went to Oneyville and was employed in a textile company where was Sam as an Arrow down in Westerly. He formed a local union of the textile workers. They got the union in, but they fired my father. He then no longer had to walk the deck of an aircraft carrier. Now he walked the mean streets of Providence as one of the capital city's finest, a Providence cop. Both my mother and my father worked long and hard, along with many other couples, where the husband worked in the Providence Police Department, in order to bring in a union, the Fraternal Order of Police, so that those extended families could have a decent life, beginning back in the 1940s and the early 1950s. And my mother and father, and this is the reason I'm bringing them up, they gave me one of the greatest skills that anyone could ever hope for in this world of ours. I was cross-fertilized. And what does that mean? I could sit down at a young age and talk with governors and mayors, senators, professionals, university presidents, or I'd feel just as much at home talking with bus drivers, mechanics, laborers, secretaries, groundskeepers, you name it. And so I think in many ways, the Labor History Society's membership, the executive board, reflects my own belief in that people who aren't really supposed to sit down and break bread together need to do it. That's what makes us unusual. You show me another place where PhDs can sit down with other people whose initials after their name is APB, All Points Bulletin. And you know, there are some ordinary people that would be scared to death to walk in and talk to professors, and believe me, there's just as many professors who'd be scared to death and walk into your labor union meeting. That's the wrong thing in America. That's not what we were built on, regardless of how well we've done. I was born and lived in West Elmwood, just below Columbus Square, in 1946. My dad used to direct the traffic at the corner of Earl Street and Buckland Street, right on Elmwood Avenue, in the late 40s and early 50s. And I, 5 or 6 years old, would go up to meet him. Route 95 had nothing on Elmwood Avenue back in those days. It was the main cog in transportation in Rhode Island. And I can remember Model T Fords, brand new Chevys, UTC trackless trolleys, an array of trucks that you would never want to see again as long as you lived. And my poor dad had to keep them going. But when the congestion died down, He put his arm around me. He was 6'2", 225 pounds. I never caught up to him until the last year or two. He started to shrink, I started to grow. We'd go across the street to Dave Shapiro's drugstore and get a funny book, a comic book today, a soda pop, or a bag of Planters peanuts that used to be in a jar that had the peanut embossed on the side of it. I always remember that. I wanted to get that. I think that's where my collection came from. But the best part of my early relationship with my father, which soured over the years later on, and then came back together again, was that on Saturdays, he had to walk the beat up Elmwood Avenue. And you can tell I got a soft spot in my heart. I used to take the Elmwood Avenue, rip the bus anytime I could get it. It was like driving through the family scrapbook. But on Saturdays, my dad would pick me up on Buckland Street. We used to live across the street from the Pickle Works. Boy, you've known you made it in this world when you live across the street from the Pickle Works. Woo! Boy, did it smell. But my dad would pick me up and we'd walk the beat down Elmwood Avenue through a working class canyon. And before I knew it, it was gone. But I never forgot it. We went by the old Star Market, by the statue of Columbus, which was fabricated by steel workers at Gorham Manufacturing. We went by the barber shop where you knew everybody in the chair or was standing around it. We went by the Italian sandwich shop where they cut the whole loaf of Italian bread in half, filled it with cold cuts, and sold it for a quarter, and somehow made a profit. And across the street from that was Peskin's drugstore, some clothing stores, and then the great icon of my life, the Elmwood Theater. Because my dad had his uniform on, I'd go in and get free popcorn, get taken upstairs to the projectionist booth, and see the latest John Wayne movie, all for nothing. Life would never be any better than that. My sister and I, we never lived more than a stone's throw away from Elmwood Avenue. But our upward mobility continued as we gravitated up Elmwood Avenue eventually to Roger Williams Avenue and into the Reservoir Triangle. And in those days, there was a residency requirement that any city workers, firefighters, policemen, municipal workers, teachers, had to live within the city limits because the city wanted to collect that dues money. And so if you looked around the periphery of the city, next to North Providence, next to Pawtucket, next to Cranston, all those streets were filled with city workers. And they were the safest neighborhoods the world has ever seen. If you ever ran out your door and said, "Help, help," 40 cops would run out in their underwear with guns. You never saw anything like it. I was born in 1946, an original baby boomer, and I descended into baby boomer narcissism. The first spoiled children in American history. One of my graduate students once called us the aberration generation. My parents sent me to classical. I didn't want to go. This will be good for you. I managed to flunk out in a year. They then sent me to Bishop Hendricken to get discipline. I got thrown out after a year because of disciplinary problems. I then went to Hope High School. Boy, 3 strikes and you're out, huh? Hope in the 1960s was the League of Nations. People of all different colors, nationalities, religions. I loved it. My friends used to say, "Come on, let's bunk." I'd say, "What for? You're in Nirvana now. Why leave?" But one day, as I was repeating Spanish, the introduction to Spanish for the 3rd time, and I passed the quiz. I remember I got a 79. I was in my junior year. It was 1964, 63. And I can remember thinking to myself, you know, you dumbbell, you've taken this thing 3 times, you could at least get 100 out of it, even if it didn't study. And so I had, if those of you who are of a religious bent know what this means, I had an epiphany. Now, the Lord didn't come to me. I didn't get hit by electricity. The teacher didn't hit me with a book. I just said, this is ridiculous. One step out the door to Vietnam, or go home and start studying and making something of yourself. And I went home that night, and I never stopped. I can't tell you why. Just one of those things. I might also add that in the early 1980s, we sent a letter to RIPTA demanding that they break the sexual line and hire women, that they could drive a bus just as well as we could. That got leaked to the press, and before you know it, women were driving at RIPTA as well. The union did that. In the mid-1970s, when I was still driving the bus, don't worry, this does have an end. I had no seniority. I couldn't believe how many people took everything the union gave them for granted. Working conditions, wages, seniority, so many wonderful things, a cornucopia, a horn of plenty. And you'd ask people, where did this come from? The politicians, they love us. The company, they think we're the greatest. Every once in a while, you'd find some old-timer who said, it's the union, son. It's the union. Look it up. Over the years, other people came on board, not only the bus, but the Labor History Society. Thanks to Paul McDonald and a $500 donation from the Providence Central Labor Council, and we now had stationery and envelopes and all kinds of things. We sent the old-timers, the retirees that everyone had forgotten about, Al Sisti, Larry Spitz, Rose Tredendi, and the Red Flame. They went out there. Ann Burlack is right. And we revived and we resuscitated a history that had been lost. And we went down on picket lines at Brown and Sharp, at Gorham, at Washburn Wire, as America was deindustrializing, and not many people realized it or understood it. One thing that happened was that a lot of those graduate students that had printed and published and done so much to professionalize what we celebrate here tonight, they were now of an age where it was time for them to move on. And of the 25 people or so, they all went on to prestigious universities. And of the 7 or 8 articles they wrote in that publication we put out in 1978, 5 of those articles became books. This was a bright crew. I still stay in touch with most of them, and they've all done tremendously well over the years, and they harbor a strong feeling for us because they're all still members. We started in 1987 with 40 members. A year later, we had our first banquet. And here we are 25 years later. Unbelievable. When we started, there was a Labor History Society or some sort of an organization like that in every New England state. Today, we stand alone. They're all gone. Because as a labor movement's going down the drain, the labor history study and the societies that grew up to support it have fallen by the wayside, except for here in Rhode Island. We now have well over 400 members, and thanks to Roland Rivet. Roland, are you still here from the Local 328? Years ago, Roland said, Scott, you need a lifetime membership program. I said, Roland, what would we charge? He said, $125. I said, are you crazy? I said, do you know where you live? You're not in Massachusetts, it's in Rhode Island. We now have more than 125 lifetime members. Roland, thank you. You've seen the wonderful things we've been involved in up on the video. I wanted to say thank you to Ray and Jean are in back from the Woonsocket Museum of Work and Labor. Stand up, you guys are tremendous. And we'll be down there Labor Day in the afternoon to watch your play, Ray. We did all of this stuff, by the way. I'm almost done. You know, when you teach at school, you never have to hear the bell ring. The kids all close their book 30 seconds before that. It's all over. I can see the crowd's getting like that now, so. We did all of this on a budget of $7,000 to $8,000 a year. That's right. $7,000 to $8,000 a year. And I always laugh when people call up asking us for a donation. From what? I don't have anything. But we make all our decisions by consensus. The executive board is all voluntary. Nobody gets paid a blessed thing. And I've always said, and somebody said it's something a little different that Don did about the monument to the Irish, that would outlast everything. But with the new technology in town, the books, the pamphlets, the articles that we write will be saved on a library shelf, on a CD. God knows where they'll end up. But I guarantee you that hundreds of years of now, all the hard things that we did today will, over time, bring the labor movement back next week, next year, somewhere along the way. And so after a quarter of a century, I stepped down as having been either president or secretary-treasurer. And as Bob said earlier, I'm not retiring. Don't go out and say that. Race the people trying to run me over down at URI now to get my job. What I won't be doing any longer is stuffing those DM envelopes. I'm telling you, I hated doing that. And for you cheapskates out there, and I know there's a few of you sitting there, you haven't paid your dues this year, even though it was due in April. Oh, don't laugh. Because that beautiful car you left out there doesn't have wheels any longer. No, no, no. And there's a small group of what the Providence Journal would call labor thugs waiting for you to help you out. Now, you can avoid all that by seeing me before this is over, which will be in just a minute. By the way, when I left RIPTA in 1984, to go and work for Claudine Schneider, a liberal Republican, and I eventually became her chief of staff in the mid-1980s, she didn't have a bad labor record, but organized labor had never endorsed a Republican at that level. And I said, boy, I can change this. She was good on mass transit issues. And her labor record wasn't that bad, 60%. I mean, it wasn't 100, but it wasn't bad. So under my guidance, we kind of told her where to vote and where not to vote. But the one thing that turned it all around, because she eventually got the AFL-CIO endorsement, was Billy Turner, who used to be the president and business agent of the Pipe Fitters Union. He wanted to get on the Newport Naval Base so bad. Oh, he knew there were Davis-Bacon violations and all kinds of other things that the building trades are concerned about. I said, Billy, I'll get you on that base if I have to ram a car through the guard gate. So we get on the phone, and you know, when you're in a congressional office, you have certain access to things that people don't know about. And that captain down at the naval base, he didn't want a commander, and he certainly didn't want a rank and file trade unionist coming into his place and telling him what he was doing wrong. Oh, but we called the Pentagon. Oh, we called the Labor Department. We called the U.S. Navy. We called this one and that one until they all knew me by my first name. And finally the day came when Billy Turner drove into the Newport Naval Base and did his investigation. After that, Claudine was golden, and so was I. It was a wonderful time. Finally, You heard about me going to Providence College. That was really a PhD program for people who had been an altar boy. I lied about it. I was never an altar boy. But I studied with one of the greatest minds in American history, Dr. Patrick T. Conley. And I put out a 500-page dissertation, which now I use at home as a weapon. It's so big. And I wrote the history of the Union and the company back to the American Civil War. And I also took several courses with Dr. Paul O'Malley, where I learned about Irish history, and that led me, of course, to the Famine Memorial, Joe Bannigan, and the pardoning of John Gordon. And again, even though we've applauded them already, I want to thank Ken Dooley, the good representative from Newport, and Dr. Pat Conley, who lectured about John Gordon for 30 years. He did all the dirty work long before anybody else, and that's where I picked it up. And even those two gentlemen will admit that some of the things they learned came from that place as well. And so we undid a justice so many years ago, and I want to thank all of them for that. I said it was a tough drive from here to Kingston. After you left, the bus drivers really didn't trust you any longer. You went down to URI, the professors didn't really trust you because if a bus driver could teach, who the hell couldn't teach? But I did well. And somewhere along in my career there, an awful tragedy occurred at URI. A geologist, I don't even remember his name, took a fall when he was out during the summer doing on some sort of expedition, and he died from his injuries. Now, you've seen in the newspaper lately the greatest perk that we can get at URI is that the professors' children go to school for free. Kelsey got a scholarship, so she was off the hook. But the widow called me up. I said, why are you calling me? She said, because you've got a reputation of getting things done. I said, well, the union can do it for you just as well as I can, but I'll be glad to listen. And she said there was nothing in writing, and there wasn't, that the children of URI professors could go to school in case something happened to the faculty member. And she had a kid already in URI and another one graduating from high school ready to go there as well. And the school wouldn't give her a definitive answer. Well, I did what any good trade unionist would. I went to the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors. They knew about the situation. And I made a motion that we, in our collective bargaining, go over that situation so that people, in case of some tragic death, their children are still covered. And they negotiated that into the contract. And when they did, and we had the formalization, the finalization of that contract, I brought Kelsey and Katie, my two daughters, I don't know if you remember, Kels. I brought them to the union meeting and explained to them what we had done and that the labor movement always looked out for the kids, always looked out for our family, and that's what we were all about. And whether you remember that or not, you little brat, I'll find out later. The last wheels are being taken off the cars now, so 5 more minutes. You know, in all the times that I've ended up honoring so many people over the years until we democratized it and everybody got an opportunity to introduce people, which was a great change. But anytime I've introduced anyone, I've always tried to end up on a high note. Well, I don't know. Took you all by surprise there, huh? And different times I've used different ways of speaking. Remember about the yuppies? It was all about looking out for number one. We needed to go back to the old labor anthem that an injury to one was an injury to all. Oh, people would go crazy. I talk about the World Trade Tower. when the firefighters were rushing up into that inferno to save lives while other people were rushing the other way to save their lives? And how in the world did those people go from being national heroes to suddenly public enemy number one because they had a decent pension? What happened? And how soon has the American public forgotten in this economic crisis that it emanated from Wall Street, not Main Street, from Congress, from the politicians, not from us? But you know something? It's always easier. Oh, it's always so much easier to blame your neighbor, to blame the bum around the corner, the person across the street. They get too much. I grew up in America where people would say, did you hear what so-and-so got for a new benefit? No, what was it? They got 2 weeks vacation. 2? You call up the business agent and say, what are you, crazy? You're sleeping down there? We need 2 weeks off. And before you know it, everybody in the neighborhood had 2 weeks off. We were the tide that rose all those boats up. That was the labor movement. Today, we live in a nickel and dime society where people only want to take things away from you. Well, look at that bum over there. He's got a benefit that I don't have. Take it away. And where is all of that going to lead us? Well, it's going to lead us to the last thing I actually have to say. And that is 100 years ago today. 100 years ago in 2012, going back to 1912, one of the greatest strikes in American history was waged not too far down the street off Route 495 at Lawrence, Massachusetts. There was a spontaneous strike, a walkout in 1912. The American Woolen Company, which hired about 25,000 people in that city. These were people, 25, 30 different nationalities, who in the old world were bitter enemies. And yet now in America, they were co-workers, even though a few years earlier, they hated each other's guts. And the strike became known as the Bread and Roses strike when a reporter interviewed a young Italian woman, an immigrant, 17, 18 years old. He said, why are you on strike? And she answered very simply, because she didn't have a command of the language. She said, for bread and roses too. Because bread, we all understand. It's bread on the table. It's a shirt on our back. It's a roof over our heads. But oh, the roses, huh? Because the roses represented entertainment, culture, education, family. People didn't want to work any longer simply for such little money. They wanted a life. And that was the Bread and Roses strike, mostly unskilled workers who didn't make $10 a week. The strike was led by the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, made up mostly of immigrants. But there were a couple of hundred skilled workers in that huge factory. Loom fixers, machinists, carpenters, and others who had to do one thing or another. They were well paid. They were the elite. And Joseph Ettore, one of the great Italian agitators of his day, set up a meeting between the skilled and the unskilled. And he said, the company pays you more to create a jealousy between all of us. And then he said in the most telling words that I've ever heard in labor history, he said, either you reach down and pull us up, or we'll be forced to reach up and pull you down. Either you reach down and pull us up, or we'll be forced to reach up and pull you down. That should be in the Bible. That's a beautiful story. And so, an injury to one is an injury to all. Reward your friends and punish your enemies. Don't forget the Knights of Labor. Remember Sam Gompers and Mother Jones. Remember the wonderful CIO and all those tremendous victories that they achieved in the worst of times, the Great Depression. That's the labor heritage. We are America. We stand for what's right. We stand to help other people. We always have. We always will. We've got a tough spot right now. It ain't gonna last. Solidarity forever, everyone. Thank you.
Inspiration through the workers' blood shall run. There can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. But what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? Union makes us strong.
David Scott Molloy was born to Miriam and David Molloy on August 17, 1946. He was raised on Elmwood Avenue in Providence, Rhode Island, where he saw his father, a World War II Navy veteran, devote himself to public service as a police officer. As Scott grew into adolescence, he would begin to develop the values and principles that would become the foundation of his beliefs as an adult. His early exits from Classical High School and Bishop Hendricken brought him to Hope High School, where he would begin to get serious about his academic pursuits. Graduating in 1965, his tolerance and understanding was nurtured by the multicultural diversity he found there. Scott's college years were spread over several campuses, ending in his enrollment in Rhode Island College in 1967, a time ripe for protests that would whet his appetite for the years to come. His campus activism, which involved anti-war organizing, civil rights demonstrations, and picketing graduation ceremonies, would lead him to his first job as a graduate assistant in history at the University of New Hampshire, where he led a sit-down strike in the president's office. Following the completion of his master's degree in 1972, Scott served a one-year stint as a bank teller and 1 day as a junior high school teacher. His working career began in earnest when he took a job with the Rhode Island Public Transit Authority, where his Irish immigrant grandfather had started working in 1909. Two uncles were also employed by RIPTA, and one of them became the business agent for the Union. Scott's leadership in Division 618 and his love of history combined to inspire him to write his first labor history document, a pamphlet of RIPTA's history, which earned him front-page press in 1977. Scott says his career and his ego were ready to go. In addition to the many local actions carried out by Scott and his members into the late 1970s, his rise from steward to president and business agent of Amalgamated Transit Union Division 618 would bring him and his members to every picket line in town, including a busload of revelers from the annual Division 618 clam bake to a South County action led by a young Rick Brooks.
One of the things I always admired about Scott as a union leader and that I tried to emulate was his commitment to connecting his members and his leaders to the struggles of all working people. Back in 1981, my union, Local 76 of the Service Employees Union, was in the middle of a very difficult strike at Allen's nursing home. And over Labor Day weekend, while our members were on the picket line, his local had a picnic planned down in South County. And Scott organized his members to come by our picket line in large numbers, really boosted the spirits of our members, and then they invited our members to join them at the picnic. It was a great day.
The strikes of the 1970s and the early 1980s provided an atmosphere ripe for a firebrand like Scott Molloy to make an impact on the labor movement, which enjoyed increasing strength in numbers throughout these years. Scott also began to develop lifelong relationships with community organizers and labor leaders who would each make their mark on Rhode Island labor history. After 11 years with Division 618, Scott decided to return to academia to pursue his doctorate degree at Providence College on a full-time basis under Dr. Patrick Conley. Following completion of his degree in 1991, Dr. Molloy was hired as a professor for the URI Labor Studies Center by Dr. Ted Schmidt. His doctoral manuscript would be published by the Smithsonian Institution, which was also the recipient of more than 10,000 items of labor history memorabilia amassed by Scott over the years. URI Special Collections has also recently benefited from Scott's contributions. His academic work led to multiple publications or to contributions that he would make to the growing legacy that would eventually lead to the founding of the Rhode Island Labor History Society in 1987. Scott's prolific works documenting historical labor movements and their leaders would eventually lead him back to his Irish roots. In recent years, Scott Molloy has traveled extensively in Ireland and is widely recognized both here and there as one of the foremost authorities on the history of Irish immigration to the United States. Of course, such noteworthy accomplishments by Scott Molloy could not go unrecognized. In May of 2010, Scott was presented the most prestigious award given by the American Postal Workers Union at a regional convention in Newport, Rhode Island. Scott's teaching awards and other accomplishments reached their pinnacle when he was inducted into the Rhode Island Heritage Hall of Fame to join the ranks of Roger Williams and Thomas Dorr. Among Scott's more significant legacies is the Rhode Island Labor History Society. The early leadership of the society would build an organization that today is almost 450 members strong, with 60 labor unions counted among the members. The Society's annual dinner, always a sellout, has recognized over 100 outstanding individuals and their contributions to the labor movement and to working people. A major highlight of the Society's accomplishments is the monument erected and dedicated to the 1934 Salesville Massacre during the American Textile Union strike that year. Both at the original Labor Day dedication and again in 2011, workers gathered to listen to Scott and others speak about union members who lost their lives in the 1934 textile strike. Of course, the legacy left for others is always personal. His activist friends, his family, which includes Marcia and his daughters, Kelsey and Katie, have supported and shared in Scott's mission. This mission has been carried out in the classroom, with union members, and through the Labor Vision program produced by the Institute for Labor Studies and Research. Dr. Scott Molloy continues to this day to be what he was always destined to be, a tireless worker and inspiring speaker who has dedicated his life so that labor's history will never be forgotten. Solidarity forever, the union makes us strong.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Labor Vision. We appreciate your input and encourage your comments. Labor Vision can be seen 3 times each week, Tuesdays at 7 p.m., Thursdays at 8 p.m., and Saturdays at 5 p.m.